Hello everybody, I'm Peter Laws and welcome to the Flicks the Church Forgot, where we dig into the deeper and sometimes spiritual themes of horror. Now check out the website for a whole bunch of in-depth horror movie reviews in my podcast, especially I guess I'll point out episodes 78 and 79, where I review Stuart Gordon's superb version of H.P. Lovecraft's tale From Beyond from 1986. Now in that episode I reflect on how that story highlights the inbuilt human desire to transcend the five senses and the terror we might feel when we get a shock to see what really might be from beyond. It's a very cool story and a really wonderful film. But for this series of videos, I'm going to be reviewing a whole bunch of H.P. Lovecraft-related paraphernalia from books and CDs and movies, and we'll be asking ourselves, particularly in this episode, just what is it about this man who's long dead that still seems to grip and squeeze the imaginations of so many people across the globe, including myself? And we'll be addressing the idea of, well, with me being a Christian, how can a Christian really be into the atheistic nightmare world of Lovecraft? Because I am. And so the Flicks the Church Forgot will be looking at H.P. Lovecraft, and tonight we explore the man, his theology, yes, his theology, and his enduring influence. Now, Howard Phillips Lovecraft was born on August the 20th, 1890 in Providence, Rhode Island. And here in the UK in 1890, there was a whole bunch of interesting stuff going on. Queen Victoria was still on the throne, and Oscar Wilde was publishing his first and only novel, The Picture of Dorian Gray. And it was also a time when the practice of modern spiritualism was really taking root. You see, just a month before Lovecraft was born, here in the UK, spiritualists were holding their first ever national conference in Manchester, exploring how we might connect, or people might connect, with the supernatural realm, or literally reaching out to the beyond. But also in 1890, that was the year when the Welsh horror author Arthur Machen published an early version of a massively influential horror story called The Great God Pan. Now, if you haven't read that story, it's a pretty chilling read that both H.P. Lovecraft and Stephen King and others would become really quite spellbound by. And it is a pretty creepy story indeed. But over in America, while Machen's story was hitting the shelves, H.P. Lovecraft was born, whose own influence, even though he was incredibly influenced by Machen, we'll talk about that later, his own influence would eventually eclipse that of Machen and many other of his contemporary writers, leading now to films and festivals and conferences and Lovecraft clothing and ornaments, you name it, there is a Lovecraft-themed version of it. In fact, even on my car, I have a Lovecraft Miskatonic University parking permit. Now, I'm not going to go into too much detail about Lovecraft's life because there's a lot of it out there already, and I don't want to just retread old ground. But if we want to understand Lovecraft as a potential theologian, it's important to note that his early life had a horribly generous portion of tragic misery. When he was 3, his father, Winfield Scott Lovecraft, had a nervous breakdown, and he was sent to a place called Butler Hospital in Providence. He was there for 5 years. Now, Howard was 8 years old when his dad eventually died there of syphilis in the walls of Butler in 1898. Lovecraft was obviously would have been disturbed by this, and also added to that, he was always a real home bird. But when his grandfather died, who he was being looked after, him and his mum were forced out of the family mansion, the family house, and Lovecraft became greatly depressed at the loss of his birthplace. He even contemplated apparently suicide. But he had a fascination for learning and science and for the fantastic, and he threw himself into study in much the same way as many of his characters in his books have done. So many of his heroes in the stories are academic professors or students that are hungry for more and more knowledge, and you really get the impression when you read Lovecraft that these men are Lovecraft himself in at least some form or another. However, illness, and quite possibly prompted by his mental state at the time, forced Lovecraft to give up school, which really embarrassed him and was a source of great shame for him. In fact, it would be for many people. Just as an aside, I've got to be honest with you, I remember when I left school, I applied for university in Nottingham, and I was there for 10 weeks, but I knew that the course was not right for me. It just wasn't working. I didn't like where I was living. It didn't work at all. And I didn't want to be there, and so I decided to drop out. And I remember calling my mum. It was in December, and I was outside. There was snow falling all around me because I was at a phone box, you know, on the street. And I remember trying to try not to cry at the sheer shame and embarrassment I felt at failing at something. I dropped out anyway, and I went to Lancaster University the following year, which actually worked out great, not least because it was where I met my now wife, and also, oddly enough, is where I became a Christian. Let me get rid of that little Cthulhuoid there. But anyway, Lovecraft had this sense of shame in his life from dropping out of school, far worse than I have experienced. And perhaps the stigma of his dad's mental collapse was there, but also, to make matters worse, his mother, Susie Lovecraft, had a very odd approach to parenting. The biographer S.T. Joshi says that Susie Lovecraft would pretty much psychologically abuse her son and would call him physically hideous. She also had a great fear of the outside world and a terror of change, which interestingly her son Howard would pick up too, and he would echo throughout his own life. You see, Lovecraft lived in Rhode Island, in Providence, most of his life, and there was a brief period, I think, when he moved away from there, and he hated that time, and he eventually moved back there. His gravestone even says, you know, I am Providence. I'd love to visit there one day. If anyone's out there wants to have me as a guest, I'd love to come. But this fear of change and what might be out there was reflected time and again in his work. His stories are often about normal, respectable people encountering situations so alien and beyond and out there that they force the protagonist into a state of change, or madness, or indeed regression to a previously unknown original form, which is pretty wild. Just look at some of the films that are based on his work. Reanimator, From Beyond, Dagon. I like Dagon. And The Whisperer in the Darkness, which is great. We'll look at that in a couple of episodes' time. It's everyday people being thrown into the tornadoes of metaphysics, and that brings change. This theme of terror at what is beyond the norm permeates his work, but it's interesting that it riddled his mother's mind, and clearly riddled his. But having said that, I think we ought to be careful not to paint Susie Lovecraft as sort of a one-note hideous basket case. You know, Lovecraft himself wrote after her death that she was one of the few people who really got him, who really understood him. But then in 1919, his mother's periods of depression grew out of control, and like his father before him, she was confined to the very same hospital, Butler, where she also ended up dying, inside those same walls that the father died in, and she died in 1921. Now, the weirdly matching fates of Lovecraft's parents, I think really is, in many ways, it's very chilling. And whenever I think of it, I find myself so filled with sympathy towards Lovecraft, but also I feel filled with a great deal of respect for him. Because while he could have just folded up, I mean, he could have collapsed or folded up and into that situation, he simply, instead, he started to wade through his misery, and he refused to let that stuff define him. And what may well have saved him was his love of science and of learning, but a key was in writing horror, or rather what he called in his essay, Supernatural Horror in Literature, cosmic horror. I meet many people who think that horror is a negative form of entertainment, that the effects will only and always be destructive or aggressive or debilitating for the viewer and will sap life from the soul. I've met plenty of people who think that horror is a genre that can only ever subtract from life, or if it is to add to life, it would only be adding in the sense of bringing something dark into your life, like evil. Like horror might give you the desire to murder someone or go insane, or at the very least, give you unhelpful nightmares. I think perhaps, though, one of the reasons Lovecraft appeals to so many people, including myself, is because he saw the constructive power of horror. He threw himself, really, into crafting tales of fear and terror and shapeless monstrosities that could throw any observer into a sort of instant shrieking madness. And yet that's what happens in many of his stories. Yet these seemingly negative emotions were somehow lifelines to him. They helped him through. They somehow helped him make sense of the world and the horrors that he had to deal with in his own life. I think that's what horror can do. That those who really love this genre are not fearless sociopaths who have no sense of right or wrong or positive or negative. You know, I think many horror fans see the shadows of real life around them and of personal tragedy and disease and violence and death and are quite afraid of them. And they're disturbed and horrified by them. I spoke about this a little while ago in my Babadook review. But they have this desire to learn and classify those fears, to bring them into some sort of manageable order. And Lovecraft was the sort of person who did have his demons, for want of a better term, but he was able to make those demons dance to the tune he played, eventually, so that he could wrestle with these shadows, yes, but he was able to build something out of those shadows too. I personally think that's pretty cool, and it's pretty inspiring. And build he did, with a whole host of fantastic horror tales, which I'm going to be looking at in the coming episodes. Tales that have slipped off the pages of the written word and have now infested, if you will, audio and video and sculpture and music, knitting. It's like Lovecraft, like I said, gets everywhere. Now, I've met some people who say it makes no sense for a Christian to enjoy H.P. Lovecraft. For a start, he was, by all accounts, an atheist himself, and he paints a world in which, in many ways, there is an utter absence of any sense of Christian hope. Yet, just because Lovecraft wasn't a theist doesn't mean that he wasn't a theologian. Yeah, that's right. I think Lovecraft was a great theologian. Just, if you're confused about that, what I mean by that, the word theology literally means to have some sort of reasoned discussion about a deity. If you've ever discussed God with somebody, whether you believe him or not, in a sense you're engaging in theology. And Richard Hooker was an influential 16th century theologian, and he described theology as the science of those things that are divine. And so Lovecraft himself may have been an atheist, but his Cthulhu mythos certainly seems to keep being at pains to place everything in a cosmological context, albeit a terrifying one. There are gods in the world that Lovecraft writes about. There are indeed deities there, but while they are different from the Christian God, they aren't different in a really obvious way. I think an obvious approach would have been to write a mythos where there was an anti-god in charge, a sort of Satan or Lucifer figure who just simply wanted to ruin and destroy the lives of human beings because he hated them, and he had some sort of personal beef with them. That I guess would have been the more straightforward choice. But what's fantastic, and also I think quite unsettling about what Lovecraft does with his gods, is that they often neither love us nor hate us. They are just completely indifferent towards us. And if they ever are bent on our destruction, it's just in the same way as I just flicked off that little green thing off of here. I didn't even think about it. Just get out of my way. It's the same way that you might sweep away dust from the floor. To Lovecraft's gods, we are like just pieces of worthless dead skin that just need to be swept off the earth to make way for these gods when they return again. And they are so powerful and so beyond defeat that it's no surprise to find that the human characters in his work are frequently just met with such despair that it turns them into madness. You see, one of the creepiest things about Lovecraft's stories, I think, and one of the most enduring ideas of it, is that we see people facing the reality that they are nothing, that they are powerless to stop themselves being swept away or consumed. Not all horror, but a lot of horror has an adventurous spirit to it, in the sense that there's a hope of heroism somewhere. Just maybe we might drive a stake through the vampire's heart. Maybe, just maybe, we'll shoot enough zombies in the head to make it to the island and start a new life and have civilization once more. But in Lovecraft's world, there is no island that you can escape to. There is no sanctuary. There is no hope. And that is unsettling and frightening. In the Bible, In Psalm 139, the psalmist praises God for his omnipresence, the fact that he's everywhere at the same time, and for his omnipotence, the fact that he has all power. But just let's imagine putting Psalm 139 into Lovecraft's world, where it was describing, let's say, the work of Cthulhu. It would be chilling. It's the very nature of God and his power that transferred to someone like Cthulhu is frightening. Psalm 139 says, "You hem me in behind and before, and you lay your hand upon me." Such knowledge is too wonderful, or rather, in his case, terrifying for me too lofty for me to attain. Where can I go from your spirit? Where can I flee from your presence? If I go up to the heavens, you are there. If I make my bed in the depths, you are particularly there. If I rise on the wings of the dawn, perhaps on your wings, if I settle on the far side of the sea, even there your hand will guide, or rather crush me, your right hand will hold me. Now, I'm not saying Cthulhu was omnipresent as such, but the idea behind Lovecraft's work is that, like, the threat is always there and will never go away and will somehow get the upper hand. And that's why so many Lovecraft's heroes go straight up mad, because they have to face the fact that there will be no escape, that heroism is a misnomer, because there is no happy endings. Any dreams of safety and peace are completely futile. Brave new worlds, drivel. They're pure fantasy. Now, I guess this begs the question, you might find it weird that a Christian like myself should enjoy spending time in this hopeless world, but I'm sorry, but I just do. There's just something... Well, firstly, I get a kick out of that sort of thing because I guess I'm a bit weird, but also there's something powerfully humbling about Lovecraft's work. It reminds me that in the big scheme of things, I'm quite small and weak, and oddly enough, Jesus said that those who are weak and admit it are really the strongest of them all. And so, yeah, I like how Lovecraft works. Makes me feel small and weak. Yes, I get a kick out of the spookiness of Lovecraft. I mean, that's the main drive, I guess, the atmospheric creep of it all. But he really pushes philosophical, scientific, mathematical, geometric, and theological buttons. He's really working it all. And oddly, it's the hopelessness in the midst of that that gives, I think, his work a very special sort of lasting power, particularly in an age where people don't necessarily really believe in a deity anymore. His work fits in, I think, to this current climate. This is one of the reasons why I really quite enjoyed Stephen King's latest book, Revival, which was very Lovecraftian in tone and was actually directly inspired by Arthur Machen's The Great God Pan. It says so in the dedication page. But Machen is interesting because Lovecraft described him as the greatest living writer of the horror tale, yet he was also the son of an Anglican minister in Wales. And while Arthur was fascinated by paganism and the occult, he did wind up in the high Anglican tradition himself. And this sense of his Christian faith would bring a thread of hope into his horror, where, as Lovecraft, his stories tended to always end on a beat of despair, pretty much constantly. Now, I really enjoy that, and oddly enough, I feel more at home with Lovecraft's work than Machen's, though I gotta say, I barely scratched the surface at reading Machen, so how can I say? But while Lovecraft may have shown despair in his fiction, I think it's important to say his own life was not defined by devastation or loneliness. As far as I know, I'm not a Lovecraft scholar. He wasn't the type who just always wanted to shun happiness. In fact, I'd say he actively sought it. He sought contentment. He sought success. He sought significance. He kept sending his stories away for publication. He may have feared and in some ways loved the world of the indifferent Cthulhu, but I get the impression he didn't want to live in that world. And in a way, I'd say that's exactly what I'm like. I love the world of Lovecraft's mythos, and I find myself drawn to it quite frequently. If you like Lovecraft, you'll understand what I mean when suddenly, you'll think, I'm in a Lovecraft mood right now, and you might want to read some of his work, or, listen to some music related to it, or just think of the vibe of it. But like him, while it's a cool place to visit, I wouldn't actually want to permanently live there. I wouldn't want to die there. Now, Lovecraft never attained the success and recognition that he deserved, and that, to be honest, makes me quite angry to think that he was considered as little more than a hack by many before he died, and to think that he never knew how meaningful he became to later generations is yet another tragic hand dealt to a man who may well have been prejudiced and racist at times. Yes, he wasn't perfect. He had his faults, but he really deserved his recognition in his lifetime, and yet he didn't get it. I suppose, therefore, if Lovecraft's mythos is true, he may, and some people believe his mythos is actually real, he may, therefore, now, Lovecraft might be at best a plaything, or at worst, the dust on the feet of the indifferent gods. Alternatively, if Lovecraft's atheism is true, and it may be true, you know, I'm a Christian, but atheism may well be right. If that's true, then Lovecraft, of course, is simply no more. The man has ceased to be, and there will never, ever be another word said from Lovecraft's mouth. No more stories spun, no more words written. But this is where I guess I hope that it's the horror world of Mackin almost that turns out to be true rather than Lovecraft's in the end. That cosmic terror might indeed exist, but that behind it there may well be some sort of cosmic awe and good. And if there is a deity, that deity might actually be more like what the psalmist was really talking about. One who loves and values and wants us to continue. Now that world simply might not exist, and I accept that the biblical God, frankly, may be as fictional as Cthulhu or Dagon. Although I put my faith in it, but it's stupid and intellectually unreasonable to think it's impossible to be wrong. But I really think that I am drawn to this idea of there being an actual loving God. And if that's true, that means perhaps on an eternal plane somewhere right now, H.P. Lovecraft goes on and he is sitting there chuckling to himself, aware of the impact he's had on society now, but also still writing fresh stories and delighting and terrifying the horror fans of heaven. Now, after that introduction to H.P. Lovecraft, do join me for the next few episodes where I'm going to be taking a look at a whole bunch of H.P. Lovecraft books and films and audio dramas and music. And I'll also be sharing some of my favourite H.P. Lovecraft stories. But until then, don't forget to subscribe to my YouTube channel, or you can follow me on Twitter or Facebook, or even, you know, if you want to, you can read my column, my horror column in the print magazine, the 40th Times here in the UK, but it's available worldwide. But until next time, don't forget Lovecraft, and don't forget the flicks the church forgot.